and welcome to the Sailing and Cruising the East Coast of the United States podcast. I'm Bela Musits.
And I'm Mike Wasserman.
Hey, Mike. Today's guest on the podcast is Dan Kerpelman. Dan and his wife sailed from Rochester, New York to Portland, Maine via the St. Lawrence River. Now, this is really interesting because it's not a route that's often taken by sailors. Just to give people a little geography lesson, Rochester, New York is on the Great Lakes. And it's on Lake Ontario, and Lake Ontario is the last of the chain of Great Lakes, and that drains into the St. Lawrence River, heading east, a little bit northeast, and eventually out into the Atlantic Ocean. So most people who are in Rochester, New York, or the Great Lakes, Lake Ontario, and they want to head south, they would actually get on the Erie Canal. And they can do that in Rochester, actually. They can get on the Erie Canal right there, and they can head they can head east through the canal until they hit the Hudson River, and then they can go south on the Hudson River and get out into the Atlantic Ocean, and then they can go anywhere they want. And that's probably most of the people, most sailors and cruisers take that route. But Dan took a different route. So he went out to St. Lawrence, which means he went through Montreal and the Chambly Canal. Another way to go, I should take a step back. I'm sorry, I misspoke. You can do the St. Lawrence, and then you can get into the, I don't know if I'm probably saying it right because my French is not great, the Richelieu River, heading south into the Chambly Canal, which takes you into Lake Champlain. And then Lake Champlain has a canal south that'll connect you to the Hudson River. But that's not what they did. They went out the St. Lawrence River, up around Newfoundland, and down around Nova Scotia, and eventually into Maine. So quite a long trip, an interesting trip. And I think there was a lot of great lessons that Dan learned during that trip. So I thought it was a great conversation we had.
Yeah, agreed, Bela. This is definitely qualifies for what I would call the scenic route. And yeah, it's a long way around, but through some beautiful country. And I think listeners, you'll love this episode. Some things to look out for. This was sailing that started freshwater to rivers to ocean sailing all on one trip. And Dan did a really nice job of talking about this kind of step by step as the challenges came up and how he overcame them for what sounded like a really amazing trip. So yeah, I think stay tuned for these and some great general lessons on getting the best out of kind of life under sail.
Great points, Mike. Let's get right into my discussion with Dan. Hello, Dan. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Bela. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for doing this. So one of our other guests reached out to me and told me about you and said that you have lots of sailing experience and that one of the trips you have done is sailing from Rochester, New York, which is on the Great Lakes, and all through the St. Lawrence Seaway and up around the northern part of the United States there in Newfoundland, I guess, and then down the East Coast. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. But before we dive into that, just tell me a little bit about how you got into sailing. So if I go back, how far back do we have to go to say there's young Dan sailing around in a sunfish on a lake?
Well, I'm going to date myself, but it goes back 61 years to when I was 5. You can do the math. And my father had a small wooden dinghy sailboat, and that's where I first experienced sailing. Later on, at the ripe old age of 7, I learned how to solo in a sunfish at a little sailing school in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And then, I went through the usual stages of most sailors, some dinghy sailing, some racing, some windsurfing. And then when I had a family of my own, I decided, rather than running off on my own, I decided to get into more cruising and larger boats. So, I got some training, bought a first starter boat, which was a McGregor 26X, for those of you familiar with that vessel, and progressively, acquired larger boats and extended the horizon of cruising over time.
Yeah. It's amazing. So many people that I talk to on this podcast start off on a lake someplace, or a little marsh, and on a sunfish or a little dinghy. And it's just remarkable how many people, that's how they start. Very few people sort of start, okay, I think I want to learn how to sail. I'm going to go take a couple ASA courses and charter a big boat.
Sure. And quite honestly, if you can sail a small boat, it's a lot easier to sail a big boat. And we know that.
That's
I mean,
right.
port maneuvers and diesel engine repairs aside, sailing a large boat is frankly a lot easier than a small boat. So it's absolutely the right way to learn, in my opinion. And
Yeah.
and I also, you may know, I also teach basic keelboat, and I think it's great to get back to small boats once in a while and remember your roots. You mentioned how funny it is where people start sailing. You'll laugh when I tell you, I mentioned my father had this little wooden dinghy. I didn't tell you where. It was on the Cooper River in Camden, New Jersey. If you know anything about Camden, New Jersey, it's the last place you think of when it comes to sailing.
Yeah.
But there we were on this rather polluted little water in the city, and that's where we sailed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it doesn't need to be clean water to sail in it.
No, except when you capsize, it's preferable. We did.
Yeah. I did some sailing on the Hudson River about the same number of years ago, when the Hudson River was a lot more polluted than it is these days. And I remember once going to my doctor because I had this little scratch on my leg and it wasn't healing. And he says, "What you been doing?" I said, "Well, I've been, out sailing on the Hudson River and tipping over a lot." He goes, "Okay,
there you
now
go.
I know what's causing it."
That's right.
So
I know where some of that toxic sludge came from, because I think I worked for the company that produced some of it.
Oh, who'd you used to work for?
GE.
Oh yeah, me too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I worked for them. My first job out of graduate school was at General Electric at the R&D Center in Schenectady. Yeah.
Oh, small world, because that's where I was as well. That's where I started with GE as well.
Holy smokes! So, okay, I got to ask. So I started there in '75, and I worked there till about '79 or '80.
Okay. Well, we wouldn't have overlapped, because I started there in '85.
Oh, okay.
And then by '88, I moved on. I stayed in GE, but I moved to one of the operating divisions. I moved to the healthcare division in Wisconsin initially, and then numerous other places. In those days, GE liked to move people a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that for sure. Well, great. So let's get back to sailing. So you took this trip from Rochester and up around the St. Lawrence Seaway, Canadian Maritimes, and then eventually into Portland, Maine. So talk a little bit about that. Sort of why were you doing it? What sort of motivated you?
Sure. Well, most of my sailing, I grew up partly in the USA and partly in Switzerland on Lake Geneva. And most of my sailing had been on fresh water, either the Great Lakes here in the US or Lake Geneva, as I mentioned, in Europe. And after a point, you kind of get to know pretty much every square inch of those bodies of water. We'd sailed Lake Ontario for 6 seasons, I think. And I sailed in Europe since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. And my wife and I both retired, or partially retired, and we decided it was time for some broader horizons and bigger adventure. And we'd heard about this thing called the Down East Circle Route. I don't know exactly where we heard of it, but we read up, and it sounded like a great trip. It was a little off the beaten track. A lot of people sail as part of the Great Loop through the canal system in New York to the Hudson, where you sailed as a kid, and then on down. But we wanted something a little more exciting. We also didn't want to drop the mast, and we wanted to experience the ocean. So, I'd done sailing on the ocean ad hoc, but never extensively like this. So anyway, push came to shove. We decided that was the trip we wanted to take. We started planning just before the pandemic, and then we had to put it on hold for a couple of years. Most of the trip is in Canada, and the borders were, of course, closed. But once that restriction was lifted, we revisited the question. I asked my wife if she was still into it, and she was, very much so. So off we went. The trip itself is a little shy of 2,000 nautical miles. You exit the Great Lakes. You exit Lake Ontario, where it enters the St. Lawrence River at the Thousand Island Archipelago. You continue along the St. Lawrence for a good part of the trip. heading up towards Montreal, Quebec City, around the Gaspé Peninsula, which is where the St. Lawrence River opens up into the Atlantic. I think it's probably called the Gulf of St. Lawrence at that point. And you head down, now you're in the province of Quebec. And incidentally, this trip covered 2 US states and 5 Canadian provinces. The one we spent the most time in was probably Quebec, which is obviously a very large province as well. And it begins near New York State and continues all the way around to the Atlantic and down to, I think it's called the Chaleur Bay, which separates the province of Quebec from the province of New Brunswick. So we enjoyed that province and rounded the Gaspé Peninsula, headed down, crossed into New Brunswick, crossed over to Prince Edward Island, crossed back to Nova Scotia, rounded the southern part of Nova Scotia, crossed the Bay of Fundy, which is exciting and known for its immense tides, into northern Maine, and then we worked our way down the coast of Maine.
And how long was that elapsed time on that trip?
We left, let me think about this. We left in late June and we arrived in early September. Now, we weren't going as fast as possible because we spent a lot of time sightseeing. You know,
Sure.
we would spend days at a time laying over just to enjoy the places we visited. So one could do it more quickly, but in our case, we spent, I guess that adds up to 3-ish months.
Yeah.
I think it was
Sounds
7 or
like-
8 weeks. Yeah.
Sounds like a wonderful trip. And what
was.
kind of vessel did you do this in? What was the vessel?
This was a Beneteau, a 2018 Beneteau 41.1 Oceanus. So a 41-foot sloop,
Yeah.
production boat that
Very
we
nice.
had acquired in 2018.
And it was
we
just the
sailed
two
it.
of you?
Just the two of us. We did buddy up for a while. We'd met another couple of sailors the year prior. We were circumnavigating Lake Ontario, and we met a lovely young couple from Ontario who were planning also to do the same trip. And then, in their case, continue on to the Bahamas, which we weren't going to do. So we buddy boated with them, I'd say, for the first half of the trip, and that was great. You know, we weren't locked at the hip, if you will, but we would catch up every couple of days. We'd stay in radio/text message contact, and it was good. You know, we were both building confidence. They were relatively new sailors, and we were new to some of the new experiences that this trip provided. So it was nice to have another friendly boat nearby. But we remained independent at the same time. And then the latter part of the trip, we tended to go more our own ways. But we often met people that were doing similar paths, and we would, kind of connect, sail more or less together for a few days, and then move on. That was nice. And I would say the human encounters on this trip were probably as interesting and as fun as some of the aspects of the sailing and sightseeing itself.
Excellent. So, I've done a little bit of sailing on Lake Ontario in my professional life. I used to go to Rochester often, as we were
Lucky
talking
you.
about it. Yeah, a little bit before we turned on the record button. And some places that I've sailed in have lots of places to stop. Every 20 miles, there's a place that you can pull into. There's a nice marina or a nice bay to anchor in or pick up a mooring, get off the boat. You can, go sightsee. And other places, sometimes it's a day or two before you can stop someplace. So how was this trip with reference to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bela. And theoretically, one can do this trip with day hops, theoretically. But the definition of day hop to some is a little different than to others. And in order to do day hops the whole time, we were talking about 80, 100-mile days, nautical mile days. And as you point out, especially on Lake Ontario, but even, up on the St. Lawrence and even on the Atlantic, there aren't that many places to stop. It's not like when you're sailing, I don't know, in, Rhode Island or Long Island Sound
Right.
or what have you.
Right.
And it takes careful planning. Obviously, one can sail overnight as, it wasn't something we necessarily sought as an experience. We were willing to do it when we had to. And we clearly had some days where we'd left in the middle of the night in order to arrive at our destination during daylight. Most cruisers prefer to arrive somewhere unknown when they can see what they're doing. which was very much our case. So, there were some partial overnighters, but theoretically, if you're willing to do some long days and, have some very early mornings, you can do day hops. But like I said, some of those day hops were close to 100 nautical miles. Now, the good news is on the St. Lawrence, you have quite a bit of current pushing you. So, even if your boat speed is something like 6 or 7 knots, your speed over ground could easily be 11, 12.
Oh, wow.
And so we were, yeah. And there's generally prevailing westerly winds as well, pushing us. So between the current and the winds, with the caveat that one needs to be attentive to tides, and tides do become a factor on the St. Lawrence. Once you hit, well, pretty much after Montreal and definitely by Quebec City, you're dealing with tides that are quite formidable and can reverse the net current of the river. But if you time things right, you get a nice push, and therefore we didn't have to do any really long overnighters.
Yeah. Excellent. So are there any other kind of unique navigation challenges? You got to go through canals. Other sort of, I mean, there's a fair amount of commercial shipping on there. Talk about those a little bit.
No, I don't want to sound intimidating, because as I've told many sailors, this is very, very doable by a couple or a shorthanded crew without tremendous offshore experience. So please don't take these comments to dissuade you if it's something you're thinking about. But there are challenges, particularly for freshwater sailors, and they come in series. The good news is they don't all get thrown at you at once. You kind of get them sequentially. So the first challenge is currents, river currents, as we discussed. I mean, the Great Lakes are fairly still when it comes to, I'm not aware of any currents or tides. So by the time you get into the St. Lawrence River, even as close to home as the Thousand Islands, where you first enter the St. Lawrence, you're already dealing with a 2-knot current pushing you, and that increases. And I think it probably maxes out at about 5 or 6 knots, and that happens right around Montreal. The good news, of course, is the current's in the right direction. And let me give you a little anecdote of how I learned how to not deal with currents. And that leads to one of the other points you raised, which is shipping traffic. There's quite a bit of shipping traffic. They're huge freight ships. I mean, they're several 100-foot long freight ships. They call them Lakers, but they're ocean-going vessels for all intents and purposes. And they have priority in the Mark Channel along the St. Lawrence. So pleasure craft have to give way, regardless of other circumstances. One situation, I was facing a freighter coming upstream. I was going downstream, of course, and I decided to just move just outside the Mark Channel. And I decided to move outside just upstream of a navigational buoy. Of course, with the current, you need to calculate a little more clearance than you typically would. So I sideswiped a buoy, and that was a good learning in how to deal with currents, and namely to pass buoys down current rather than up current, unless you really know what you're doing. No damage other than the pride and a little pain I needed to rub out, but it was a good lesson. But anyway, that was challenge number 1. Number 2 being traffic and just learning to deal with it. But it's not hard. I mean, you've got plenty of advance warning, either through AIS or visual. I will say that the Laker captains weren't necessarily the most responsive when it came to VHF contact. I think they looked scornfully upon pleasure craft and view us as more in the way than, someone to share the waters with. So we did often, as is good practice, try to make radio contact, and in many occasions they did not reply. But as I said, between AIS and visual contact, we never had any real concerns with traffic. You do need to leave plenty of clearance, though. The third challenge was tides. And as I said, that becomes a factor, around Montreal, actually a little sooner than Montreal. And just like I learned the hard way how to deal with currents, I also learned how to deal with tides the hard way. We pulled into an anchorage near Sorel, Quebec, one night, and according to the charts, tides weren't yet a factor. So I followed breadcrumbs back out the next morning and actually ran aground. So apparently there was a little tide, and but we were able to muscle her off the shoal and get going again. So no damage other than, once again, to pride. And great learnings. I mean, there's no better way to learn than to get into a little bit of trouble. Hopefully not serious trouble, but that was number two. And then or number three. And I think the third challenge I would say would be tides. And the tides and the currents interplay in a very interesting way on the St. Lawrence. So much so that the Canadian Hydrographic Service publishes a 130-page book that describes, that includes tide and current tables. And no one can understand that book. I mean, I tried that thing several times, front to back to front, started in the middle, worked my way out. I couldn't make heads or tails out of that nonsense. And I'm sure there are people smarter than me that can. But in the end, we learned to keep it simple and basically timed our departures a few hours before high tide. And the reason for departing a few hours before is because the, let me get this right, the flow tide is shorter in duration than the ebb tide. And that is because the current of the river cancels some of the flow tide current effect. So you may have an ebb tide, but the river current is stronger than that ebb tide at the beginning. So that gives you a little bit of an extra window, and thus the earlier departure. And if we left 2 hours before high tide every time, we did pretty well. We rarely had to face tidal current in the opposite direction. But again, you know, if you're trying to do day hops, tides don't occur the same time every day. So there's a little bit of math involved. But most people after a while fell into a natural, that we know who've done a similar trip, they fell into a very natural rhythm and it became sort of second nature. But tides were a challenge. In terms of dockage, you know, tides can also be a factor, anchorage or dockerage. In the case of anchorage, of course, you need to figure out your scope according to the extreme. So if you come in at low tide, you think you have enough scope. Well, you may not by high tide, and vice versa. You may have enough, you know, depth, but by low tide, you may no longer have enough depth. So you kind of have to play chess here and think not only what's going on at the current moment, but think 2 moves ahead, what's going to happen. The other thing that's interesting with tides, specifically at anchor, is something you don't encounter on the Great Lakes, and that is 180-degree change in direction overnight, typically. And that takes some getting used to because you have to think about your swing room differently. Well, you should always think about 360 degrees of swing room, but it's a little bit different here. And the other thing is, I don't know about other boats, but our ground tackle makes an awful noise when the boat's shifting 180. The chain kind of bounces a little on the anchor roller on the bow. And of course, the hull acts as a great amplifier. So the first couple of times we were sure we had broken loose or somebody hit us or who knows what, but eventually get used to that phenomenon and relax about it. So that was a challenge. You asked about navigational challenges. You know, the navigational marks are the same in the US and Canada, you know, fundamentally read, right, return. Of course, when you get out onto the Atlantic, you have to deal with the clockwise versus counterclockwise convention. But on the river, essentially downstream is considered going out to sea and upstream is coming back. Marinas, for the most part, have floating docks. So when you stay at a marina, you don't have to worry too much about tides. One interesting marina relative to tides was Quebec City. The primary marina there is already into some serious tidal waters. I would say maybe 4 or 5 feet of tide. But in order to maintain the marina level, there's a dedicated lock. So in order to get in and out of the marina, you have to go through a lock.
Oh, wow.
And that brings, yeah. So that allows them to maintain constant level inside the marina, regardless of the level of the St. Lawrence River outside, and bring boats up or down. And, you know, you have to schedule your arrivals and departures accordingly. Now, of course, at slack high tide, they leave the gates open, and that's a little easier. Let's see. Yeah. And on the subject of locks, I think there are 7 locks between Lake Ontario and Montreal, essentially. The locks end at Montreal. So those take some getting used to. And, you know, they're not hard, especially when you're down locking. When you're up locking, there's a little more turbulence in the lock as it fills with water. But when they empty with water, it's fairly smooth. The challenge with locks is they are there for the commercial ship ships. And while they tolerate pleasure craft, they don't make it easy. You have to reserve your passage the day before, but that doesn't guarantee you'll get in at the prescribed time. And basically reserve for either AM or PM, but nothing more specific than that. So when you get there, it's usually a waiting game. And there were times when we had to wait, 4 or 5 hours to get into a lock. And that's annoying, especially, if you're trying to time things relative to the concept of day hops and so forth.
Right.
But again, we kind of got used to it. We found ways to entertain ourselves. Sometimes we hovered. Sometimes there was a small floating dock just outside the lock where we could tie up. And the best thing about that is we met a lot of really nice people waiting for locks, people who we would meet subsequently on the trip.
Yeah.
So from a challenge standpoint, I would say those are the main ones. When we got out onto the ocean, there aren't a lot of, in Quebec and Nova Scotia in particular, there aren't a lot of marinas for pleasure craft, and there aren't that many anchorages either, or at least they're spaced quite a ways away. So finding planning for places to stay at night required a little forethought. You didn't want to just start sailing and figure it out once you got there. But if you did a little advanced planning, there were plenty of places. And interestingly, we often wound up in commercial fishing ports. And if you spend any serious time in New England, like I do, fishermen aren't known necessarily to be the warmest, fuzziest of folks. So when we learned we had to stay in fishing ports, we were thinking, oh, that's not going to be a very good experience. We're not going to be very welcome. And we were shocked at how nice a welcome we actually had. We would enter fishing ports where the dockmaster would move trawlers around to make room for us, to give you a sense of it. In one case, we were in rural Quebec in a fishing port, and we were invited into a kind of a fish shack at night to have dinner with the fishermen, and we were part of the family. Now we speak French, which helps a lot, and but the Anglophone sailors that we met along the way said they had equally warm welcomes as well. So we thought it would be a challenge, but it wasn't. So don't be intimidated if you ever have to stop in a fishing port. Really, between the maritime provinces and Quebec, we met some of the nicest people you'll ever want to meet. This is a little bit off the topic of challenges, but I want to mention it so I don't forget. But we would be in a marina, somewhere in the rural Quebec, and we had one of those folding wagons that a lot of cruisers have that we'd use to go provision. And we'd be walking down the dock, and total strangers would see us, and they just hand out their car keys and say, "Hey, looks like you're going shopping. Take our keys." No questions asked. I mean, that was so lovely. Now, we appreciated the chance to walk and stretch our legs, but the gesture was kind, and we always brought back a little something from the supermarket as a sign of gratitude.
Yeah. It is remarkable. With many guests on this podcast, we've talked about sort of the sailing and the marine and the boating community, and oftentimes how supportive and helpful they are. And if we could figure out how to put that in a bottle and propagate it through the rest of the world, the world
Right.
would be a much better place.
I agree. I think the landlubbers could use a dose of whatever that magic is
Yeah.
these days.
Yeah.
So just
go ahead.
Just continuing on challenges. So we've exited the St. Lawrence. We're now in the ocean. One thing we appreciated and was a pleasant surprise getting onto the ocean was the difference between chop and swell. Those of you who are ocean sailors probably think it's foolish to be surprised by this, but it was a pleasant surprise to us. We're used to Great Lakes chop, and if you sailed on the Great Lakes, these are very irregular, short amplitude, short frequency waves that knock you all over the place, especially if you have a light displacement boat like a Beneteau is. And on the ocean, the predominant waveforms are swell, which are built up over long distances. They're nice, regular, smooth sine waves. And even though they can be quite big and initially intimidating, they're much more pleasant to sail in. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have chop on the ocean. And sometimes chop combines with swell and creates what the term seems to be confused sea state, which we learned also translated to confused sailors, trying to figure out how to work through that. But again, like everything, you get used to it, and it was nothing crazy. Crossing the Bay of Fundy, many people are intimidated by that because of the tide. I mean, the Bay of Fundy has the world's largest tidal change, I believe, with upwards of 50 feet. And if you're anchoring and docking and visiting around the Bay of Fundy, that's quite challenging. We did not do that. We did a straight crossing from Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, to a small anchorage near Machias, Maine. And in that situation, the only issue is tidal current. But the good news is the crossing takes about 12 hours, and because it's a diurnal tide, the tide's about 6 hours in each direction. So essentially, you hold your course, and the tide pushes you to port for 6 hours, and then pushes you back to starboard for 6 hours, and you wind up landing right on target. Right. So we really didn't experience anything tricky with the tides of the Bay of Fundy, but it was psychologically interesting to know how much tide we were sailing over. And I would say the last challenge and the two last challenges and the biggest are the fog and the lobster traps in Maine. And the two combined are the perfect storm of stress. So much so that we know sailors that swear they'll never sail in Maine again. The only thing I can say about it is you get used to it. It's better to hit, if you do want to do this trip, if any of your listeners are considering it, it's best to leave a little later. Everyone wants to leave as early as possible to get there as soon as possible. But in this case, we intentionally held back and didn't leave till late June because the fog is less of an issue in August and September than it is in June and July as things warm up. I don't know what to tell you about lobster traps. They're just a reality. There's no season in Maine. It's all year round. There are no rules. There are busy anchorages that are clogged with lobster traps. There are narrow navigational channels that are clogged with lobster traps. Sometimes they're hard to see. If the current's strong, it can drag the buoys under. If the sun's in your eyes, it can make it impossible to see. And the worst case is low tide. These traps have two buoys typically. And at low tide, the upper buoy obviously lays flat and the lower buoy appears on the surface, and there's a piece of horizontal line between the two. And that's just ripe to snag with your keel or worse, your prop. We did snag one on our keel only once, I'm glad to say. I don't know how we got off that easy, but we were sailing, so we didn't have the prop spinning, and we had a folding prop. We snagged it on the keel, and eventually just worked its way under the keel and released behind us. But those are challenging and quite annoying for many people. But again, like everything, you get used to it. You just learn to post someone on the bow if visibility is limited. Take it easy, go slow, especially when you're motoring, because you don't want to wind something around your prop and get to swim in 55-degree Gulf of Maine waters. And have have a backup plan, basically a good knife, a wetsuit if you need it. I believe they lose 30,000 traps a year in Maine.
Holy smokes.
It's kind of expected because they're so indiscriminate about where the lobsters are put. And I have great respect for the lobstermen. I mean, they're great people. They work hard. But the reality is they put their traps where they see fit.
Yeah.
For those of you who are worried about the lobsters for those sunken traps, I'll point out that there's a regulation that requires a biodegradable trap door on the traps.
Right.
So if they're lost with a lobster in them, eventually the lobster has an exit.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We get some lobster traps down near the mouth of the Narragansett Bay. We get a fair number of crab traps in Narragansett Bay, and they too have those little doors on them that sort of rust off in essence. So if they get lost, but they're not all that bad. So did you have I'm just curious, did you have a line cutter on your prop?
We did not on this boat. Again, with the folding prop, I don't know if I would call it an assumption or a hope was that we wouldn't snag anything.
Yeah.
Our new boat has a line cutter, but one time we needed it, it didn't really work. So not sure how effective they are.
Yeah, either am
But
I.
no, we did. We did
Yeah.
not have one on that boat.
So
I'm
for, go
Dan
ahead.
and a knife, or yours truly and a knife for the line cutter on that boat.
Yeah, I think so. That's right. But having a wetsuit is I have a wetsuit on my boat,
Yeah.
just for that purpose in case I got to jump in sometime.
Yeah. I also I'm seriously considering one of those snubas, the
Yes.
floating compressors. I'm not a scuba diver, but it's hard to hold your breath a long time in cold water, especially when you get a little older in age. And so I could dive a few seconds at a time down to the prop, but I
Yeah.
found it challenging. So I'm thinking for
Yeah.
the future that might, Maine's our home territory for sailing. So I'm thinking it might be a good addition to the boat as well.
Yeah, it's amazing how short a time I can hold my breath for.
I know.
I don't get it, right? And I'm a runner, right? I run almost every day.
So am I. I think the issue, Bela, is that you're typically not diving for relaxation. You're diving under stress because you're in a difficult situation. So that doesn't help. The cold water doesn't help. And you're usually in a hurry because you don't want to drift, or there's other traffic or who knows what. So they're not optimal circumstances for diving for long periods of time. Maybe down the Bahamas looking at pretty seashells is a different story.
Yes, I agree. The stress I think is a big factor there. Any challenges with seasickness?
Not at all. We're blessed not to get seasick. Sometimes if, as with most sailors, if you're down below doing some chores, cooking, or looking at charts or what have you, you get a little queasy. But we never had anyone get seriously seasick. And if you get queasy down below, you just come up, look at the horizon, take the helm, and it goes away. We were very lucky that way.
Yeah. And did you take any medication to prevent it?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Excellent.
My wife and I are fortunate not to have any seasickness or other health-related concerns. We didn't have any accidents. A couple little nicks and cuts, nothing a Band-Aid couldn't take care of.
Yeah.
Or an Advil or two occasionally.
Yeah. So it sounds like you had AIS on the boat.
Yeah.
A life raft?
We did not. We have a dinghy, which, is a very controversial subject when you suggest you might use that as your life raft. But it was coastal cruising. We were rarely out of sight of shore. Not that that's a good enough reason, but we did not have a life raft.
Okay.
Other things we did add. Well, first of all, we completed our canvas in the cockpit to include full enclosure, which was a lifesaver. It got down in the 30s some days, even in August. We, at one point, I think the farthest north we got was somewhere along the St. Lawrence, and we stepped over the 49th parallel. And it can get a little nippy up there. So we were glad to have that enclosure. Bugs weren't a factor. Interestingly, we had screen or vinyl on that enclosure, and bugs were not a factor, much to our surprise, because on the Great Lakes, bugs are very much a factor. So that was a pleasant surprise. But back to equipment, the things we did add, we added an inverter. We added some solar panels. We added the enclosure. I think those were the main things. The boat obviously came with good electronics, autopilot, and what have you.
Did you have a generator?
A portable Honda, the little red Hondas. That's it. Yeah, we didn't have a built-in generator. The boat, in spite of its 41 feet, didn't have all that much storage space, so we were very cautious about how much stuff we added.
Yeah. So power management worked out okay? You motored enough to charge up the batteries, and
it was fine. Yeah. One thing a lot of people say who've done this route is that they do motor more than one would expect. We would have liked to say we sailed most of the time. We motored or motor sailed a good chunk of the time. And again, that was in the spirit of trying to stay to mostly day hops, and you kind of need to get from A to B.
Right.
Right. So as a result, plus the modest solar that we put on was plenty, and we never had any concerns. We had, we had AGM batteries. I think we had 4 80 amp hour AGM batteries for house service, and that was always plenty.
Excellent. So is there Was there like one resource that was really helpful for you to plan this trip?
A few. The number one is Captain Cheryl Barr's book called The Downey Circle Route. She's a Canadian certified captain who wrote sort of the definitive cruising guide to this trip, and that was extremely helpful. We picked up sort of regional cruising guides along the way, but for the entire trip, that one was critical. Of course, like most sailors, we use Navionics. Aqua Maps is becoming popular. A variety of weather maps, tide apps are really helpful. Although with Navionics and most of the nav apps these days, you also have built-in tide tables. But if you had to boil it down to two things, probably Navionics or a similar app, a couple of good weather apps, and Cheryl Barr's book, and you're all set. And of course, local knowledge is always useful. Talk to people; they know so much more than anybody can document in any single guide.
Right.
But take what you hear with a grain of salt, because at the end, you're responsible. And if somebody guides you astray, you're still, responsible. Right. So you always want to take maybe a few opinions, triangulate, cross-check with an app or what have you.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things, sort of down in the part of New England that I sail in, staying at marinas, if you're a transient, can get pretty darn expensive. It's somewhere between $7 to $12 a foot per night. Yeah. Narragansett Bay is like pretty expensive.
Wow.
Long Island Sound, Boston area and stuff. So how was that? How was that experience for you guys?
It's nowhere near as expensive as Middle Atlantic, Southeast. We've later sailed the East Coast as we've discussed offline, and I saw some of the price shock you're talking about. But on the St. Lawrence and Maritimes, it's not that expensive, and the Great Lakes are even less so. And of course, anchorages are free.
Yes,
and there are plenty of them. Good anchorages too.
Yeah. Hey, Dan, I want to start wrapping this up. We've been chatting for a while.
Oh yeah.
So if someone's listening to this and they're thinking, "Hey, well, this sounds like a great trip," I think I'm thinking of doing it. What 2 or 3 big tips of advice or lessons learned would you share with them?
Well, first of all, I think like any cruise planning, but to a point. I see people that get paralyzed by the planning. They want to have 100% of the data all worked out. You'll never get there at some point. So while I'm a strong proponent of planning, I'm also a strong proponent of stopping planning at some point and just head out. You can keep planning along the way. You can keep gathering information along the way. So I think if you're going to do it, there comes a point where you just have to do it. The second thing, and we talked a lot about challenges, what we didn't talk about, but I think is equally important, is all the amazing things you're going to see along the way and not to miss. So, and there's something for everybody. I mean, if you're interested in, cosmopolitan city life, spend some time in Montreal, spend some time in Quebec City. They're both fascinating, beautiful, multicultural cities with tons to offer. If you love, the natural beauty, the Gaspé region is awesome. It's a national park. You have to stop at the Saguenay Fjord along the St. Lawrence and Tadoussac. That is a beautiful fjord off the St. Lawrence, and it's also the feeding ground for a variety of species of whales and seals. We saw belugas and minke whales galore, and just an amazing stop. So don't miss that. The Gaspé and the first rock, it's called the Roche Percée, as you round the Gaspé, is amazingly beautiful. It's natural arches in a rock formation offshore. In fact, that formation became emblematic of our trip. It was the thing, we've got to see this up front and personal, and it's definitely beautiful. The anchorages along the coast of Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia are fantastic, full of wildlife, seals, clams, and I guess the other tip is take the time to meet people. They want it. They're lovely, and if you take the time and show some gesture of kindness, maybe bring a few little inexpensive souvenirs from home to share. It's amazing the relationships you'll build, some will last the duration of a stop, and some will become lifetime friends, as was our case as well. So definitely do that. Another spot not to miss, of course, is Acadia National Park. Once you cross into Maine, stop in Bar Harbor's a little touristy, but it maintains its charm, and it's, of course, at the gateway of Acadia National Park. I could go on and on about the highlights of the trip, which we don't have time for. But I guess my point is, it's a sailing adventure, but it's also an amazing way to discover some of the most beautiful countryside, wildlife, and people you'll ever meet.
Right. My last question, any challenges with provisioning for such a long trip? Were you always
Not
able
really.
to stop and find places?
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, in rural Quebec and some of the deserted anchorages, there's not much going on, but we never ran out of food, and we didn't have massive refrigeration or storage either. And like I said, someone will always hand out their car keys if you're dragging your wagon down a dock in a marina. So
Yeah.
no concerns there. Look, if you speak French, it helps a lot in rural Quebec. The further you get from the cities, the less English is prevalent, but Anglophone sailors had no trouble at all. And there's one thing that's universal that works in every language in the world, and that's a smile.
Yep. That's for sure. That's for sure. Hey, Dan, this has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed
Likewise, thank
learning
you.
about your trip. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It was my pleasure, Bela. I enjoyed chatting with you. And
Cool interview, Bela. And, as someone who's lived near the St. Lawrence River for 15 years, when I lived in Potsdam, New York, that's just a stone's throw from the St. Lawrence. So I'm pretty familiar with that stretch. I love Dan's stories, and I loved his descriptions of the trip and the travel that he did. And even starting in Rochester. Rochester is, you spent some time there, as you said, is kind of one of the maybe underappreciated cities in the Northeast in terms of they've really done a nice job developing that. I think people might know the history that Kodak was there and Xerox were there and lots of big company and the money that came with it. And then when those companies, kind of great American companies, collapsed, right, the city kind of really went down. But they've really done a nice job of revitalizing it and making it a nice place to visit and live. So I'll put in a little plug for Rochester. But yeah, the St. Lawrence is a really cool body of water, and I've traveled quite a bit of it. So yeah, this is a really, really cool story. Bela, what were your big takeaways?
Yeah, let me second your endorsement of Rochester. I've spent a fair amount of time there during my venture capital days. In particular, I used to go to the University of Rochester and Rochester Institute of Technology looking for companies to invest in. And it's really a very nice city. It's right on Lake Ontario. It's got a great downtown. And I think it's made a good rebound compared to some other cities that have lost large industries. But let's say back to Dan. So, when I got done with talking to Dan, I said to myself, that's a trip I'd like to do. It sounded really good. So it just seemed like a wonderful trip, a lot of varying sort of experiences. It's not the same thing day after day after day. The other thing that struck me is, again, we've talked about this numerous times, is the kindness of fellow mariners, right? He talked about that story of sort of coming into Marina. They needed to get some provisioning done for their boat, and somebody just gave them the keys to their car and said, hey, you can use the car, go get whatever you need and, bring the car back. And again, I've seen and experienced those types of acts of kindness numerous times. Was there anything that struck you, Mike?
I just loved this kind of idea that I mentioned in the intro of this trip starting in freshwater, right, and on a lake, Lake Ontario, right, and moving onto a river that became kind of tidal, right, and with a current, right, and then moving into the ocean, and how that became going through locks and shipping big ships and all of this stuff. It seemed like there was this kind of step-by-step, really nice from basic sailing to pretty advanced sailing in this kind of nice transition period. And he had such a nice way of explaining some of this. So I don't know, maybe could you talk about from a sailor, I'm a non-sailor really, but from your sailing experience, what does this look like to you? And what were some of the challenges that you saw that you were like, oh, wow, I've been there and done that. And maybe not all in one trip, but how unique is it to see this all in one trip this kind of progression of sailing challenges.
Yeah, I think seeing the progression all in one trip is not all that common. He went, Newfoundland has some of the largest tidal changes in the world. So he went through some places where it's pretty interesting. And the St. Lawrence River, as he talked, has 3 to 4 knot current. And on a sailboat, that's significant because most sailboats only go 5 or 6 or 7 knots. Mm-hmm. So if you're fighting, so this is where planning comes in really becomes important, right? Everyone thinks about, okay, we got to avoid the weather. We got to watch out for the weather, all that kind of stuff. But also you got to take into account tidal currents. And even in Narragansett Bay, the little place that I sail at, I can easily get a knot and a half push in the right direction, or the current's going against me. And that makes a huge difference. So I thought that was sort of neat, sort of this notion of, hey, you got to think about not just the weather, you got to think about these tidal currents. You got to think about locks. As you go through some of these locks, when you, for example, when you go on the Erie Canal or the Lake Champlain Canal, which was the other route, and down through to the Hudson, there's really not a lot of commercial traffic on those 2 canals. It's mostly pleasure boats. So you can go in and out of the locks pretty easily. But when you're in the St. Lawrence River, you're sort of, as a pleasure cruiser, you're not high priority. So, and he talked about this, right? You might have to wait. So here again, some sort of timing and planning is really important. We really get used to sort of jumping in our car and driving wherever we want to drive to. And there's really very little planning involved. We have a GPS that tells us how to get there. And maybe we have to stop to charge our car or get fuel, stop to eat or go to the bathroom. And that's about it. And it's pretty easy. Well, on the boat, man, there's a lot of other stuff going on. And I also liked his notion of, we're doing like 4-hour hops. We want to do this sort of at a relaxed pace, not a lot of anxiety. So for me, when you're doing things, when you have 8 hours to do something, but you're only filling it with 4 hours worth of stuff to do, that for me reduces the anxiety, because when you're on a sailboat, things always don't go as planned. Either you're getting there faster than you planned, or you're getting there slower than you planned, or you had to stop someplace to take care of something, or you had to stop and help somebody, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that can kind of affect how fast you're going to be able to go and get there. So I think this notion of only planning to go so many miles or for a 4-hour trip, but allowing much more time to do it in. So I think those were the 2 or the 3 big takeaways for me, particularly around the planning piece. And that's the thing that is really, even for me, I did a lot of lake sailing. There really wasn't any commercial traffic to worry about. There's no tides, no current. But there's a lot of other stuff that sort of comes into play when you're in navigable waters or salt water with currents.
Yeah, neat. I mean, I guess my last point on this, I agree with everything you said. My last point on this is, if you're a sailor that's thinking about taking on kind of a bigger challenge, taking the next step in your sailing experiences, right, to push yourself a little bit, favorite this, bookmark this one, right, and go back and listen to this one again a couple of times, because it was just, I think, filled with such a nice approach and a nice wisdom to taking on something like this, right? Everything from the planning to each step, to doing something, and he really expressed it in such a really cool way that I think that this can be a really nice kind of guidepost for somebody who's interested in kind of taking the next step in their sailing experiences. So I really appreciated both your interview of Dan and Dan for taking the time, but the listener who referred you to Dan, right? This is really cool, right? That this person did have a nice way about expressing his philosophy of sailing, and should put people at ease who are interested in taking the next step.
As usual, Mike, that was a great summary. What do you think? Should we wrap this one up?
Agreed. Listeners, thanks for joining us for yet another episode. And we hope that you found our conversation with Dan Kerpelman interesting and thought-provoking. And as always, if you have questions about what we've discussed, please feel free to get in touch with us. Our email is sailingtheeast. That's all one word at gmail.com.
And finally, if you enjoy the podcast, hit that follow button on your favorite podcasting application. Help spread the word. Leave us a review. And as many of our listeners now have done, if you know of someone that would be a good guest, send them our way. This episode is a great example of that. Dan was referred to us by one of our listeners, and I hope you enjoyed the podcast as much as I did. So until next time, signing off from snowy upstate New York. See you soon.
And from over here in Münster, Germany, where it's now dark at 4 p.m. here in early December, we'll see everybody next time. Auf Wiedersehen.